chapter 7, verses 1 to 17. Starting at verse 1. When Ahaz, son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, was king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem. They could not overpower it. Now the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. So the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken, as the trees of the forest were shaken by the wind. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, go out to your son, Shear Jashub, to meet Ahaz at the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the launderer's field. Say to him, be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these two smouldering stubs of firewood, because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram, and of the son of Remaliah. Aram, Ephraim, and Remaliah's son have plotted your ruin, saying, let us invade Judah, let us tear it apart and divide it among ourselves, and make the son of Tabeel king over it. Yet, this is what the sovereign Lord says. It will not take place. It will not happen, for the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is only Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is only Remaliah's son. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or in the highest heights. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. Then Isaiah said, hear now, you house of David. It is not enough. Is it not enough to try the patience of humans? Will you try the patience of my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to the son, and will call him Immanuel. He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. The Lord will bring on you and your people and on the house of your father a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria.
Well, as I'm sure everyone's very aware that the year is almost over. We're very quickly coming up to Christmas, and with the 30th birthday celebration a couple of weeks ago, and with Mission Week just last Sunday, plus Christmas itself being on a Sunday this year, it means that we've actually only got what is a couple of weeks of normal church services left, which is not really enough time to go starting a brand new series. We wouldn't be able to get into a new book with what is only 2 weeks to fill, especially since we've actually looked at all those one chapter books at the end of last year, all those short little books that you could normally use to fill in what is a couple of weeks. So what we're going to do today and over the next 2 Sundays, including Christmas Day, is just a sort of a short topical series looking at a few names which have been given to Jesus. And we're doing this so on Christmas Day, when we get to what is the last of what's going to be 3 sermons, we can then better understand just what his coming into the world on Christmas really means, what Jesus' birth means for the world, and what it should mean for each of us today. Because we see in the Bible, Jesus is referred to as many things. And it's important to know why he's been given all these different names and descriptions and titles, and why they actually tell us something about him and why they should actually matter to us. Because these names and titles that he's given, they do have a lot of meaning behind them. They actually explain really what Christmas Day itself is all about. Today, we give people names just basically because their parents like the sound of that name. Or if they choose a name with any kind of meaning behind it, it's usually because it's like a family connection. It's a name of a relative, like a parent or a grandparent, or someone else that happens to be important to the parents choosing the name. But in many cultures, including, of course, the Jewish one that we come across in the Bible, names meant something. The name itself means something. There's almost what you could call like a dictionary definition to the names in many cultures. So when a name was picked, we know that it actually has a deeper meaning. And on top of that, we know that when God gives someone a name, when he's the one picking the name, saying, name your child, name your baby this, well, you can be sure that there is an absolute purpose behind it. So names are not just given in other cultures, and certainly not just given in the Bible because someone just likes the sound of it. It's not just a random, I think this would make a nice name for my child. The names are picked because in the Bible, at least, they play a part in God's plan, and therefore that name, with its definition, it tells us something. It tells us something about the role that a person who is being named is going to play in the plans of God for his people and for this world. So we're going to look at 3 of these names or titles that Jesus was given, starting today and over the next couple of weeks. And that's therefore on Christmas Day, we're going to be looking at what is the last of them, which is going to be the word Messiah, or as in Christ, right? Messiah, which is what Christ basically is. It's the same word, one's Hebrew, one's Greek, but it is the same meaning. So Christ is not a last name, as many people assume, but instead it's a title. And it's a title which is special to Jesus himself. And we'll look at how this title impacts both the birth story of Christmas to be more than just a story, but a moment in history, as it's the day that God's anointed one came to the world. This is why Jesus is given this title, Messiah. But just as we'll look at the title Messiah or Christ, well, next Sunday we'll look at what is his actual name, the name that he was chosen to be given, which is Jesus. We know that this is the name given to him by God, but we also know that it was a common name in biblical times. In fact, Jesus is just the Greek for what is a Hebrew name, and that Hebrew name is just Joshua. It's a common name for Jews, and it's even a common name in our society today. We've probably all known a Joshua, right? It's a very common name. But again, it's important to know what exactly that name, Jesus or Joshua, means, and what that name tells us just about who Jesus is and what, therefore, his arrival on Christmas actually means for us all. But this morning, before we look at the name, Jesus, and before we look at the title, Christ, we're going to look at the name Immanuel, as this also tells us something very important about Jesus' arrival. We hear this one quite often. We even sing it in carols. The mission team, in fact, last week, only a couple of Fridays ago, even sung it down in the main street. But Immanuel, it has a meaning that is very important for us to know and appreciate, as it helps us to better understand the gospel and better understand who Jesus should mean to us, better understand why it is that he came to us on Christmas Day and why we can still call him that today. Immanuel, it's more than a name, it's a description, and it helps us to understand just who Jesus Christ is. So to get going, before we can look at Immanuel for this morning, just what it means, we first need to look at the rest of the passage that we've just read here and the context of what is going on, where we first come across this title, this name, Immanuel. The promise of Immanuel comes up in this passage, but we need to know what was happening that led to this declaration that someone called Immanuel would come. So thinking about the book that this passage comes from, we see that it was written by the very famous prophet Isaiah, who lived around a time nearing what is the end of the kingdoms of Israel. So a couple of hundred years before this time, before this passage, the once larger kingdom of God's people split into what is then two halves, two smaller kingdoms. There was the northern kingdom, often called Israel, or sometimes even referred to as Ephraim, and the south kingdom, often just being known as Judah. Hence why the people who lived in Judah would go from being called Israelites to being called Jews. It means someone from Judea, a Judean. And not long after Isaiah wrote this, Israel, that northern kingdom, it would fall to a large empire known as the Assyrians. It hasn't yet happened at the time of this passage, but it is going to happen only in the decades not long after Isaiah spoke it. And in Jesus' time, that New Testament age, this area is going to be known as Samaria and Galilee. It was something that we looked at in the talks over the 30th birthday celebration, where Jesus was speaking to the woman of the well in Samaria, an area which once was that northern kingdom of Israel. So this entire northern area, it's going to be wiped out, and that therefore means that this land would then become culturally very different to the one south. As people were taken away in captivity, as new people immigrated into the area, it would become very different to the Jews living in what was the remaining part of the southern kingdom of the old empire, the old kingdom of Israel. But Isaiah was from that southern kingdom. That's an important part to know. And that would go on for at least more than another century before the Babylonians came and took them captive back to Babylon, something that lasted 70 years, as we see in what is the book of Daniel, before they would then come home. But before that happened, before they were taken into captivity and then returned from the exile, many prophets, Isaiah being one, warned about the judgment coming, warned that this day was going to arrive. They said that Judah had moved very far from God, and warned that the kings of Judah had become corrupt and that they needed to change their ways because this judgment was coming. And that God was warning them to turn back to him and to trust in him, to rely on him and to stop trusting in themselves and their armies and to stop forming alliances with the nations around them. And unfortunately, that was something that was not happening when Isaiah spoke here in this passage. And it certainly wasn't happening in the north, as that was the one that would fall quicker and sooner to the Assyrians, but never restore itself, never come back. So that's the issue that we see going on here as we come to this passage. There's a warning being given about what is soon to come, about how the northern empire will be wiped out, and that the southern empire is in danger as well. That kingdom is in danger because it is simply walking away from God. And on top of that warning, there's also promises being given that God will remain faithful and how he's going to restore this now fallen kingdom, this kingdom which has become corrupted. So getting all that context, understanding now what's going on in this passage, we see as we start here in verse 1 that this actually starts off with what is a bit of good news. And we'll see as we go through this passage this morning that there's almost a bit of a that is good, that is bad, that is good kind of pattern going on, this back and forward thing happening. And it'll keep going back and forward as something positive happens, only for then something negative to then come from that. So we see in verse 1, as we start here, it says, when Ahaz, son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, was king of Judah, the southern kingdom, King Rezin of Aram, and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, the north, marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it. So this is obviously good news here. And it's a common story right through the entire Old Testament. The corrupt and the sinful nations that surround Judah, surround Israel, they attack God's people. They do it over and over again, but they can't overcome it. God keeps protecting them. He stops them from falling to these often more powerful nations around them. And that's exactly the same story going on here. They are attacked, but they can't bring what is the capital of Judah, Jerusalem, down. Judah can't be defeated. God's protecting. But after this, it then moves to what is a problem. Because we see that they're soon going to be attacked again. And the two nations, the two kings, will team up and they'll keep trying until Jerusalem falls. Because then it says, now the house of David was told. So the house of David is just referring to Judah, right? That southern kingdom, the place where what is the line of kings that goes from David all the way to Jesus will continue from. That is the house of David. They're told, Aram has allied himself with Ephraim. So Ephraim is that name that is sometimes used for the northern kingdom. So this now means that their own people, who are at this time really fellow Israelites, the kingdom's split in two, but they're really all the same people. They're all cousins, they're all brothers. Well, that northern kingdom is now going to side with their enemies, and they're going to attack the south again. Hence why we read on where it says, so the hearts of Ahaz, that being the king of the south, and his people were shaken, as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. So they've got a real fear of what is about to happen. They're being surrounded by their enemies, and they're even being surrounded by what is their own brothers. So they're thinking that they might not survive what is coming. This a next attack that is going to happen, this might actually bring them down. They might be defeated this time. God has protected them all through the history of the nation. And even as the individual tribes before that, something that Ephraim once was, it was one of the 12 tribes before it split away with the northern 10 to form that northern kingdom. But now those in the south, they're worried that they may be defeated by their enemies when the next attack happens. But this is where Isaiah comes in, and why we now move back to what is potentially more good news. We've gone from good, their enemies couldn't beat them, to bad, their enemies are ganging up to attack them again, and now we move back to what is good again. Because God says that he will not let Judah fall to this next wave of attacks, but he will continue to protect his people. He will not abandon them, and they will get through this because he will be with them. So we see in verse 3, it says, then the Lord said to Isaiah, go out, you and your son, Shear-Jashub, to meet Ahaz. Which, as I said before, that's the king of the south. Ahaz is the king of the south, the king of Judah. And Isaiah is to meet him at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the launderer's field. And then we see that when he meets the king at this place, Isaiah is to say this to him. He's to give him assurance. He starts in verses 4 to 6 by stating what the issue is, what these enemies, including what is their own people essentially, have planned. So God instructs Isaiah, say to him, be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these two smoldering stubs of firewood, because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and of the son of Remaliah. Aram, Ephraim, and Remaliah's son have plotted your ruin, saying, let us invade Judah. Let us tear it apart and divide it amongst themselves and make the son of Tabel king over it. And then after laying out what the issue is, the bad news, then we get the good news in verse 7. The promise that God will be with them and he will not let this happen. He won't let them fall. He'll stop this attack and protect them as he always has. So this is what we read in verse 7. Yet, this is what the sovereign Lord says. It will not take place. It will not happen. For the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is only Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is only Remaliah's son. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. So here is what is a declaration of the future. God's saying that this northern kingdom that is split from the south, that now plans to align itself with the enemies of what is their brothers in the south in order to wipe out Judea. God is saying within 65 years, they'll be gone. Right? They will not go on. This is how they're going to get wiped out by the Assyrians. They're going to come to their end. And as we know from later on in the Old Testament, and by the time of the New Testament, that is indeed the case. They are wiped out. There is no northern kingdom. There's just a remnant of people mixed in with other cultures, scattered in those areas known as Galilee and Samaria. So there is that next bit of good news. God is there. God is with them. He's active. He's active in the world, and he will save them. And all Ahaz, the king, all he and his people have to do is trust in God. All they've got to do is rely on him to protect them and to not fear their enemies. That, as God says here, are nothing. He says that they've got no power. They're irrelevant. The whole point of this is to say that they have no source of authority. He says the head of this is only this. So therefore, what does it matter? That these enemies are an irrelevance. They've got no real power to threaten you. Whereas Ahaz, as the king of Judah, the one who sits on what is the throne of David, he's in that line that will lead to the king who will rule forever, who will lead to Jesus. Well, his source of authority is God himself. So he's got all the power. He's holding all the cards here. Everything's in his favor. All he has to do is trust in God, and God will protect him and his people from what is this external threat. But then we get to what is the next issue. This is, again, we've had the good news, but then there is a problem. We're back to the bad news. Because we now see in verse 10 that despite this promise direct from God and an assurance of being there, Ahaz is of little faith. And he will not trust in God. And this will show just how corrupt his heart is. And how even Judah, much like the north, is actually very far from God's ways. They'll go on, unlike the north, but really they're no better. They're just as bad as their brothers in the northern kingdom. So going on to verse 10, we read here, again. So an indication of what is a bit of time passing. We're saying, again, he has been given assurances, but it seems more now has to be said in order to convince him it's okay, just trust in God. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or in the highest heights. So God is offering to give the king reassurance. He's saying, I'll help you, depend on me, and you only need to ask, and I will show you proof of my promises. I'll give you a sign. And Ahaz, the king of Judah of the south, who only has to believe, he only has to ask, we see his reply in verse 12. It says, but Ahaz said, I will not ask, I will not put the Lord to the test. Now, on the surface, when we first read this actually seems almost reasonable. Much like Jesus facing Satan in the wilderness, and Satan tempting him, saying, do this, do that, and Jesus saying in reply, do not test the Lord, which is a quote from Deuteronomy 6:16. It's a quote back from the law, back at the start of the Bible, where it says, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Well, it almost seems like it's the same thing going on here. Like this would be the correct reply, do not test the Lord. And Ahaz is therefore being faithful and saying that he will not ask for a sign because he'll just believe. He won't get God to prove himself, he just believes what God has already said. But unfortunately, that is not the case. And there actually is a very big difference between Jesus saying, do not put the Lord to the test, and what Ahaz is saying here. A big issue going on here that shows that it's not a demonstration of faith. That's not why Ahaz says that. But in fact, and sadly, it is the total opposite. It's because he's got no faith in God at all. Because, for one, this is not testing the Lord by asking for something and not taking his word for it. Because as we can clearly read here, this is the Lord himself speaking to Ahaz, saying, ask me for help, and I'll give it. And I'll give you a sign to prove it. Just ask, and you'll have it. So this is nothing like the devil, Satan, saying to Jesus, ask God for something and force him to act. Make him prove himself. Make him prove that he will actually do what he says. Now, instead, this is God saying, ask and I'll do it. I want you to ask. I'll give you a sign. And Ahaz won't ask. And he won't ask not out of faith, but due to a lack of it. He won't come to God for help. He knows the issue. He's very aware of what's going on. In fact, we know from verse 2, when they heard that the north, their brothers in the north were aligning with their enemies, that the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken. He knows the problem. He knows the danger. He very well knows the situation that he's in. God has given the promises that he'll protect them. It's okay. He's there for them. He said that the north will be gone within 65 years. He's saying, do not worry. I won't let them destroy you. That won't happen. They'll be the ones destroyed in the future. And now he's saying, since you doubt, ask for a sign and I'll give you that reassurance that I am in fact with you and I'll protect you. And the king simply refuses to ask. He doesn't want it. And he refuses to ask because he doesn't trust God. And in fact, what we see in other places is the reason for why he won't ask, why he doesn't trust God. The reason why he won't do what God says and ask for this sign. And we see that it's both due to politics and it's also due to idolatry. It is the worship of foreign gods that stops him asking the one true God for this sign. So to help show this, to give this passage really its context, because you read it and it's sometimes we might not understand what's going on, but it actually runs in parallel with another passage elsewhere. Well, here's a couple of things from what is the book of 2 Kings, from chapter 16, that talks about the reign of King Ahaz. And we read this in 2 Kings 16, starting at verse 3, and how Ahaz is not like David, but he's actually an evil king. He's corrupt and he has a wicked heart. And we read this here. It says, this is 2 Kings 16. It says there, he, as in Ahaz, followed the ways of the kings of Israel, as in the kings of the north. When it says Israel, it's saying he's like the kings of the north, not David in the south. He's like the north. And then it says, and even sacrificed his son in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations that the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and burned incense at the high places on the hilltops and under every spreading tree. So as the king of Judah, we see that he actually worshipped false gods. He sacrificed to idols. He sacrificed his own son in the fire. So he's clearly an evil king. And he trusted these gods and even in an enemy for his salvation. He turned to a foreign nation to protect them. Because we read on in chapter 16, so we get down to verse 7, it says, Ahaz sent messengers to say to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, I am your servant and vassal. Come up and save me out of the hand of king of Aram and the king of Israel who are attacking me. And Ahaz took the silver and gold found in the temple of the Lord and the treasuries of the royal palace and sent it as a gift to the king of Assyria. And then even worse, as we read on, after he's raided the temple and the royal treasuries to send it off to a foreign king to pay him to say, come and protect me from these two who are attacking him. we find that he then made an altar to the Assyrian gods as a way of pleasing that king, say, yes, we're one of you guys. We worship your gods. And he told the priests, worship these gods every day. And he even pulled apart parts of the temple of God to make way for the Assyrian gods to keep that Assyrian king happy, so that the Assyrian king would protect him from his enemies. So it is simply a lack of faith that stops him depending on God, because he sold out the nation to a foreign nation. That's really the issue. That is what's going on here in this passage. God's people do not want to know that he is there. They don't want that because they've already walked away from him. So even though God is saying, I'm here, I am with you, ask for a sign and I'll show it. I'll prove that I'm right here with you. I'll protect you. Well, the king and the people, they don't want to know him. God is with them and they don't want him there. Which is why, as we move on, we now get two things happening. We get both a condemnation, obviously for this lack of faith, for what is going on in this kingdom at this time, but also we get what is a future promise of what God will do. That there will be the sign that God is with his people, and he is one day going to bring this sign, whether the people want it or not. Ahaz is saying, I'm not going to ask for it. He's pretending to be faithful by saying, oh no, I won't put the Lord to the test. But he just doesn't want it, and God is going to give that sign whether he wants it or not. So looking first at what is the condemnation, we see it says here in verse 13, Then Isaiah said, Hear now, you house of David. Is it not enough to try the patience of humans? Will you try the patience of my God also? So I said before, the house of David is Judah, the southern kingdom. And this here is God's people. And they, more than anyone, are supposed to trust in God, as it is through God's people that God was going to bless the world. That all those promises that we read throughout the Old Testament, those things made back to Abraham, that through them, through his descendants, through the Israelites, everyone will benefit. And yet we see here his chosen people, the ones who are meant to bring this blessing to the world, they're rebelling against him. They're worshipping foreign gods. They're trusting on the Assyrians to come save them. So this is trying the patience of God. They don't follow his laws. They worship other gods. And when he says, I'm here for you, trust me, just ask for a sign, they show that they won't. They're trying his patience. They trust other nations to come and rescue them from their enemies. So this is obviously the condemnation for this. They're trying the patience of God, who has remained faithful to them all the time, and they clearly haven't. Which is why, as we read the next verse, God is going to give them this sign anyway. As said before, it's coming. He's going to do something to show that he is faithful to them and that he keeps his promises despite what is their obvious lack of faith. So we read in verse 14, it says, Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. And as we go on, we see what this sign is. It says, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Immanuel. So there's that word that we're looking at today. Immanuel. It's saying in the future, a young woman, a virgin, will have a baby, and the baby will be given the name Immanuel. That is going to be the sign that God has not abandoned his people, no matter how much a king like Ahaz tests God's patience. And of course, even just from that little verse there, just that sentence, it's not hard to work out what this is talking about, right? It's easy to see what this is pointing towards, what that sign was. We know that the young woman is obviously Mary. So Mary getting pregnant is a sign that those promises God made are being fulfilled. The reassurance not to lose trust in God, and that he's keeping those promises and he's not abandoning his plans for the world. He is still with his people. He's still going to carry out all those promises to bless the world made through Abraham. And the reason why this son, this child, will be called Immanuel is because Immanuel simply means God is with us. So Immanuel is not a name like Jesus, the actual name that the baby will take. But instead, it's a description of what the baby will be. Jesus is going to be God with us. It's a sign of just who Jesus is. And we know this from what is the Christmas accounts itself. When we look at what is the start of the book of Matthew, it quotes this very chapter, this verse. So we can know that this is what is going on. This is what the Christmas story is all about. We don't have to make the assumption that this is what this verse is talking about. The Bible itself tells us this was to fulfill this very verse. So I'm going to quickly read a few verses from Matthew 1, verses 21 and 23. And this is what it says. This is the angel talking to Joseph, right? The fiance of Mary. It says, she'll give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he'll save his people from their sins. So this is what we're going to look at next week. The name of Jesus, why God gave him that name. What does Jesus mean? We see it right there. But this passage then goes on to say, all of this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Immanuel, which means God with us. Because that is who Jesus is. He is the Son of God. So he is literally God with us. So God was with his people right from the start. He was with his people back in the days of Messiah. This passage we're looking at today. He was there. But the people didn't want to know him. They just did not want to trust in him. God spoke to the king, saying, just ask. And the king would not call on God. Instead, he ran to a foreign nation and said, you come save me. Let me sell off all the gold and all that in the temple and the treasury, and I'll give it to you, and I'll worship your gods. So now God himself will come into the world, and he's going to make himself known by being literally with us and walking on this earth as one of us. So I said before, this is not saying that his name will be Immanuel. It's not his name is Jesus. That's the name he was given. But that he'll be called Immanuel. Like he'll be called the King. Or he'll be called our Savior. Because it's a description of who he is and what he has come to do. This name is saying, he'll be called God is with us. Because this is God with us. This is the Son of God on earth. So you could take that verse 14, and you could reword it, right? If you're writing it for a kid's translation, if you're trying to simplify it, you could reword it to say this, because this is really what it's saying. Mary will conceive and give birth to Jesus, and will call him God is with us. Because that is exactly what happened. This is who Jesus is, the promise of God coming into the world, being fulfilled. And this is why we get all those other verses. There's a whole pile of them. We get all these other verses that talk about this. So we get stuff like at the start of John 1:14, where it says, the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Or we get stuff like Galatians 4, verse 4, where it says, but when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman. We get verses like this to show us what the birth of Jesus is really about. Jesus is God's promise to be with us. His promise to come to us and make himself known as he keeps his promises to bless the world through the descendants of his people. So when we think of Jesus and when we celebrate Christmas, and we will do that just in a couple of weeks from now, well, this is what we're remembering. That God promised to send his son into the world so he could be with us. Centuries before Jesus was born as a baby. The promise was that this moment would be God himself coming to us and being with us, Immanuel. So when we get to Christmas, remember this. Remember, this is the sign to all of us that all of God's other promises are also true. That he promised to bless the world, to bless us. He promised to save us. He promised to make the world perfect and new. And we can know all of that. We can know it's all true because of this sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Immanuel. Because of that being fulfilled. Well, that's why we know God keeps his other promises as well. It's why we know for a fact that he is actually with us. This is why we can now trust and look forward to all those other promises being fulfilled. We know that God will save us and bless us because he literally came to be with us, to be one of us. The birth of Jesus, the incarnation of God as it's known. That is the sign that Ahaz didn't want. It's a sign to the world that God hasn't forgotten his people. He hasn't forsaken his people. That he's kept his promises just as he always does. And that if we do what Ahaz failed to do, we do the opposite of him, which is trust in God, then we'll escape what is the coming judgment, and we inherit salvation as we know that through Jesus. We know that through him, God is in fact with us, and that because it's through his Son, he's with us always. Jesus sits on that throne for all of eternity. The kingdom goes on forever. We're a part of that kingdom, and we now know that God is with us always.